G'day, Ben here from Duck Playing Chicken with the next video installment of the SD Macross Valkyries. I have spent a lot of time cleaning these parts up. So you saw in the last video, a lot of these parts are made up of two halves that are sort of glued together, and there's a lot of stepping, a lot of seam lines to clean up. So I've literally spent about 7 or 8 hours on each of these kits, you know, the 3 of them I'm working on, cleaning up where these pieces have joined. So what I initially did was I primed them with the lacquer surfacer grey from SMS, and then of course when it's grey it's a lot easier to see where you've got any seams that are still problematic. So it's a lot harder to see just on the white plastic, so the grey makes it a lot more visible. So as you can see, I've sort of gone through and cleaned up the areas. This bit's probably a bit hard to see because it's actually blue plastic underneath, but there's just been a lot of cleanup. You know, I thought I was pretty close before I primed these, and then I realised nah, I was still a long way off. The other thing I wanted to show is that I've actually changed my technique for filling in these bits. These have they have panel lines for like the skull and crossbones, so you know, this little graphic here. Also for the eye logo for the Seeker. And I don't want any panel lines in there because I'm going to be using a combination of decals and stickers to fill that in. So what I did was I ended up using sprue goo, which is really thinned right down. So that's just a mixture of, to me, extra thin cement and a bit of polystyrene plastic. And I literally just daubed it in the middle and kind of smoothed it out. And it's still a little bit rough, but it's actually better than trying to get in there and sand, because this circular area is actually embossed into the plastic. So that's what I've done for those. Slight change to what I showed you in the last video. I think I'm almost ready. Well, no, I am ready. I'm ready to just start with the actual painting of these. So I've spent so much time with the cleanup. I think it's about as good as I want to get it. So for the 3 kits, the Strike, the Super and the Seeker, I'll be using just Surfacer White, and I'm going to be using that as the base colour. So it's going to be dual purpose, going to prime it, but also that's the final colour. It's a nice bright white. For the Armoured Valkyrie, if you watch that build, I used a slightly different colour, but I think these other 3 I'm going to use just the straight white. So now it's on to painting all those pieces white, and then I can start worrying about the masking. I've painted all the main pieces of each Valkyrie in the white, in the primer, surfacer primer, and so now it's time to do a lot of masking. And I'm trying to work out, because there's actually quite a number of colours being used, I'm trying to work out the order of operations. So I want to sort of give you an example before I mask all this stuff up to show you sort of the way I'm thinking. But if we start with the Strike, we can see that there's multiple areas that have sort of got accents of yellow. So I'll be starting with those first. And things like the little triangles on the shoulder, a stripe along the top of the torso, and these fins. There's also on the leg parts, so on these where we've got this circular section, that's actually yellow as well. Just a quick look at the masking process that I've done so far. You can see I've used the Tamiya tape, bedded it down with a toothpick, and then used a scalpel to cut around it. And I've just used this is painter's tape. It's a lot cheaper than the Tamiya masking tape, so I've sort of used that for the rest of it. So this is for all the yellow accents on the Strike Valkyrie, and for these fins there's part of it that's yellow and part of it's black. Now for the yellow, I can just paint the whole lot and then I'll mask the area where it's just going to go black over the top of it. We've got these little triangle pieces on the shoulders. And probably one of the more difficult ones to mask is there's a stripe. It's a black and yellow stripes that run across the top of the torso. And I'm going to start with the yellow first and then I can sort of mask it to do the black. But I think that's probably going to be one of the more difficult areas to mask. There's this sort of little detail on the backpack. So I've basically gone through and looked at all the areas that are in yellow, including like on the head here. There's also on the Elint, there's a couple of yellow areas, so I've sort of masked all the yellow areas at once, and then I'll just hit them all with the yellow, and then sort of move on to the next colour along. So I think that's the way I can sort of manage it, especially doing 3 of them at a time. It just makes more sense to me to sort of do it one colour at a time, because there is a substantial amount of time that's going into the masking. I'm about 1/3 of the way through painting all the pieces for the 3 Valkyries, but I just wanted to sort of show you where I'm up to at the moment. And basically I've got a number of pieces here that I can unmask. And the one thing that I've sort of found with these kits is that if you do plan on painting them, you've got to be aware it's going to be a slow process, because essentially you're going to need to mask a bit and then paint, and then mask a different bit and paint, because some of these pieces have sort of multiple colours. So just be aware of that. I have been spending quite a bit of time just masking alone, let alone the painting, because the painting usually only takes sort of a couple of minutes. You know, it's not like, you know, you're spending hours at the airbrush. All the time is going into the masking. Now thankfully, with using these lacquer-based acrylics, is that they dry very quickly, which means I can sort of mask them reasonably soon after I've put a coat down. So these leg parts here is probably a good example to sort of show the different layers of masking I've had to go through in order to get all the colours down. There's quite a bit of tape on here because, like I said, you sort of mask a bit and then paint, mask another bit, paint, and so you build up these layers of tape, and it all becomes a little bit messy. But hopefully the final result's clean. That's what I'm aiming for. I know some of the other pieces that I've unmasked haven't been that way, but keep my fingers crossed. Now some of these details you could probably paint by hand, except I wouldn't be using the lacquer-based acrylics just because they don't brush paint particularly well. Okay, so here we've got an example of the multicolour masking that's been going on. So of course there's the white base coat, there's black on the details on the side here, and then it's a little bit hard to see, but this is actually gunmetal in here in the vent and also on the front of the foot there. So yeah, it's sort of multiple colours used, and it's come up pretty clean, I think. And again, that's just pushing the tape down with, getting it into the panel lines with a toothpick, burnishing it down, and then using a knife to follow along those panel lines. Now some other pieces are a little bit more straightforward to mask because they don't have a large number of colours, so they tend to be a bit quicker to set up ready for a gloss varnish. Although these pieces that go onto the sides of the head were a little bit fiddly to mask. Not saying that, it's all fiddly to mask. That's what masking is. Now, I don't mind masking, but these kits have a huge amount of it, so it just does take up a lot of the time. Alright, so another example where we've got sort of multi-colours is one of the wings for each of the kits. Of course, again, it's sort of that white base coat, but then you have black and you also have the red for the UN Spacey logo. I know I've mentioned it before, but these paints are incredibly hardy. Certainly recommend to anyone if you're like me and you sort of worked with water-based acrylics, and you would know that they can sometimes be finicky, to say the least. But I've never had any of this stuff lift. So there you can see where I've masked the logo and also the black stripe. And of course, once I get a gloss coat on that, I'll be able to put panel lining on it to tidy it all up. That's one of the wings. The other one just has black over the white. The logo only appears on one of them. And if I really wanted to, I could have used the sticker on this one maybe, but I thought no. I want to keep to an absolute minimum where I'm using the stickers, only really where I have to, because stickers can be problematic over time. Where I store all my models is actually essentially in a shed. It's a very comfortable shed, mind you, but it's still a shed, and it does get very warm here in summer. And of course, for the adhesive on stickers, heat is no good for it, and it will eventually let go. So hence why I want to try just doing as much as I can with paint. As long as you burnish the tape down, you'll get nice clean delineations of colour. It's worth spending the time, and I say this with all the models I build, but it's worth spending that time doing the masking properly. You don't want to be rushing it. So you need to get nice clean lines like that. It just makes a difference to the final model. I mean, these things are only, they're SD kits. They're not sort of high level, highly detailed kits. But still, if you're going to put the time in, you might as well do it, to the best of your ability. Now, a lot of these pieces are the same across the multiple kits. But once they're covered up with tape, they all sort of look the same. So you've just got to be mindful of which ones you're painting which colour. So for example, this is for the strike, but if it's all sort of covered up with tape and everything, and I've got one little bit masked off, I don't necessarily know it's for the strike. It could be for the super, which actually has blue on it instead. So you just need to keep track of all that stuff. And for the gun, there is just a little bit of red on the end there, so I've unmasked that off, and that looks pretty good. Trigger still works. I've had a few slight issues, and I'm not actually going to worry about fixing them because they're pretty minor, but you can see there's a little bit of a black smudge. Obviously a little bit of black's got under where the yellow is, but I'm not going to worry about that. You're certainly not going to notice it once it's sitting on the shelf. If it was something that was sort of on the head, I might worry about cleaning it up. It is very satisfying pulling masks off, especially when they do what you want them to. Of course, it's no fun if you lift them up. You've done all this masking and they haven't worked. But I know my experiences of using water-based acrylics they tend to go on a bit wetter on the surface, and so they have a tendency to, through capillary action, they get sort of under the tape, and they can cause issues with colour bleed. Whereas these lacquer paints don't have that issue because they're almost dry on the surface as soon as they hit. It's been somewhat of a revolution for me. I know plenty of people have been using it for years and years, but I just sort of recently got into it. Yeah, certainly a far cry from what I used to use when I was a young lad, where I would use Humbrol enamels in a tin and I'd paintbrush them. And I didn't have a lot of money, so I had very limited colours that I could use, which meant that a lot of my models were the same kind of colour schemes. And in fact, one of the builds I'm planning on doing a bit later, I'll be able to show you one of those kits because I've actually still got it. And even though it's an atrocious paint job, I think it's important to hang on to that stuff because you can see how far you've come, and you can also see the different technologies that are sort of, changed the way that we work with models. That one's come up pretty good. And of course, yeah, these will come up, a lot more detail once I get a panel line wash in there. But at the moment, it's just about getting the main colours down. But yes, when I was a wee lad, you didn't have a lot of choice as far as paints, and certainly an airbrush was out of the question for me anyway. There was a couple of pretty ordinary hairy sticks and some Humbrol enamels. And the irony is that I've kind of gone back to using enamels quite a bit now because they've got a different, I guess, a different part to play in the way that I model. Using them for panel line washes, they can be good for detail painting. So, and also, like many people, I took a big break from modelling. So I used to do it when I was a young lad. My father got me into it because when he was a young boy, it was all model planes. But I remember building cars, and geez, I reckon there was even a Star Wars model in there at some stage. Would have been an old, what would it have been, NPC kit or something. Yeah, so my dad got me into modelling, and it was probably when I was living in Japan, I got right back into sort of some of the anime and manga that I'd sort of grown up with, and started looking at building models from those series. So it sort of got me back into it. I've gone back and looked at the head that I did for the armoured Valkyrie, and one thing that's kind of bugged me since I've done it is the eye piece in here. It just doesn't quite look the way I want it to. It doesn't actually look too bad in the smaller version, but on the large version it's a bit rough. And when I was looking at these other heads, I'm trying to think, the technique I used for that one probably isn't going to work particularly well for the visor of this one. It might work okay for the others, but again, I wasn't really happy with that kind of effect at that size. So what I've decided to do is I'm actually going to mask these off, and I'm going to use some aluminium. So it's the SMS metallic aluminium, and then I'm going to go over the top for the ones that are green, just with some clear green. And for the Seeker, I'm going to use clear red. So I think that's probably the way I'm going to go. The other thing I sort of thought about was using the stickers. And the stickers, I probably wouldn't mind using them, except they only provide stickers for the larger size heads. So I would like them to look sort of consistent. But that had actually sort of crossed my mind as to, you know, maybe I could use these metallic for stickers, but of course they don't provide them for the smaller size, so I still have to come up with some way of dealing with that. So what I'm going to end up doing is masking them off, go with the aluminium and then the clear colours over the top. So painting some of the details, I'm going to use some brush painting just because it's quicker than sort of masking. So some examples are the red dots on the side of the legs. Also there's sort of some indication metallic with these details on the side of the boosters, and of course the wheels and the undercarriage I need to paint the tyres black. So I'm going to start with the red details, and I'm going to use this Vallejo Mecha Colour red, and I just use a tile as my palette. I don't bother with wet palettes or anything like that. With the brush, just wipe off the excess. Go a little bit on the brush. Yeah, I'm not going to worry too much if I make a bit of a mess of it. And the reason for that is because this is water-based acrylic paint, which means these edges where I've gone over, I'll be able to actually go in with some Vallejo thinner and clean those up. So I made a big mess of that one. The other thing is the fuselage has these little UN Spacey logos on the side of the cockpit, and there was no way I was going to be able to mask those. So what I'm going to do is try to hand paint them, which is going to be a bit tricky, but we'll see how we go. Yeah, that looks a bit messy at the moment. By the time we get I sort of clean it up with the Vallejo thinner and also get a black panel line wash in there, it's going to look a little bit better, at least a little bit cleaner. The next thing I'm going to be painting is these details on the boosters, and I've already got a bit of dark metallic in there, so I wanted to give a little bit of contrast. So with these ones I'm going to be using this Model Air 71065 steel. I think it'll be a little bit brighter than what I've done for the exhaust. of details. I'm just going to highlight the details on the end of this weapon as well while I'm at it. Now for these end bits, I probably should have taken the time to fill these barrels properly and actually drill down them, but I think what I'll do is I'll end up just painting the top of them black. I'll highlight some of the details on these pieces, again just using the steel. Yeah, so I've sort of gone outside lines on one of them, but that's not really an issue because there'll be black panel liner going in there anyway. Now for the tyres on the wheels, I'll be using Steiner Res Black. Now for areas where I've gone outside of where I'm supposed to paint, I'm just going to be using some Vallejo airbrush thinner. Use one of these pointed cotton buds, dunk it in the thinner, wipe off the excess. And I'm moving it sort of in towards where I painted to try and reduce the amount of red that sort of spreads across the white. Otherwise we're going to get a distinctive pink tinge to all the white areas. But because I've used lacquer paint underneath, the Vallejo thinner doesn't interfere with it. So this is a classic case of using basically all three main different types of paints that you were using modelling to your advantage. So I'm using a lacquer paint as the base. I'm using the water-based acrylics for the detail painting, which I can then go through using some acrylic thinner to clean up. And then of course the enamel panel line wash is going to go over the top, so then I can use enamel thinner to clean that up. And so using the three different types gives me a lot of flexibility as far as, you know, being able to clean things up without affecting the layers underneath. And that way you can have a nice cleanly painted detail without it going beyond the edges of everything else. You really want to be using these pointed cotton buds for any sort of detail stuff like this, so you get right in there and clean up where you've gone outside of the panel line area. Might have to sort of go in and touch that up with the red again, but any sort of serious mistakes that I made I can clean up with the thinner. So that's the process I'm going to do with the rest of the pieces. So after I've done all the detail painting, I'm going to hit everything with a clear gloss ready for panel lining. everything is now gloss coated, ready for panel lining and in some cases decals. So for example, on the strike boosters, I'll be putting these skull and crossbones decals that I have, third party ones on the boosters. Now for the Seeker, I won't be using decals because I couldn't find water slide decals for the eye logo that goes here, so we'll be using stickers over the top of that. You can see there in the light it's a little bit rough, but I think once the sticker's on it you won't even see that. The other thing that I wanted to show was how the visors on the heads came up, and you can see it's come up pretty well. It's pretty shiny, you know, it sort of gives the look of a, I don't know, green metallic visor, so I'm pretty happy with that. It came up okay on the Super as well. Now for the Seeker, you can see there's a little bit of an area there that I've kind of missed, but what's going to happen is there's going to be panel line wash going there, and that's sort of going to hide that a little bit. So yeah, metallic red came up just as well. Now for the smaller version, I'm going to have a bit of work in here to do the panel line wash to clean up those edges a little bit, but yeah, it's far from perfect, but I think given the amount of work I've put in this thing, I'm ready to get it done, get it finished. So I'm going to leave it there for this video. In the next video we're going to be looking at the panel lining, the decals, stickers, and of course the matte coat and final assembly. So until then, I will see you on the next video.